Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of me talking about this excruciating article by Ilaria Michelis. I ended the first part saying I am not one of the persuadable, so I'm going to try very hard to be as calm and objective as I can in examining her argument. Here we go. In July 2020, J.K. Rowling infamously decided to take a very public stance on the issue of trans rights and women's safety through a series of tweets and an essay. Infamously, for Christ's sakes, could she be any more obvious in trying to manipulate her readers' emotional responses? And she doesn't even link directly to the infamous tweets, but to an article in Vogue, which also doesn't link to the tweets, but to another article in Vogue. I won't waste time commenting on the quality of those articles, but the second one finally links to two tweets she made in early June of 2020, not July, as Ilaria said. And it turned out to be the one objecting in a humorous way to women being called people who menstruate, and the short thread in which she makes some very salient, I would say obvious points about sex while reaffirming her love and support and respect for trans people. Look where that got her, eh? The next sentence is the most extraordinary in the piece so far, in my opinion. As Black Lives Matter protests spread around the world in response to George Floyd's murder, and as Edward Colston's statue was toppled to highlight Britain's lack of accountability towards its colonial past, the novelist's choice to use her substantial platform to reignite the debate on trans rights appeared highly insensitive and a product of her current class and race privilege. Well, actually, those tweets from JK were posted the day before that statue was toppled, but hey, what does accuracy matter? But reignite the debate. The debate, by the way, is more accurately described as being about the threat to women's and gay rights by gender ideology. That was what JK's tweets were about. Does Ilaria think that debate had gone away? Does she think all those feminists she disdains and all the cultists opposing us were taking a prolonged leave of absence? Surely not. Obviously, she wasn't checking my website with its thousands of links to news stories and articles regularly enough. The debate, for want of a better word, has never gone away. It has grown, and if anything was responsible for fanning the flames of boosting gender-critical activism, it was, of course, the government consultation on the GRA, for which at the very beginning of her article she seems to credit us with getting the proposed amendments stopped. As for appeared highly insensitive, to whom? This time she links to an opinion piece in The Independent by this bloke, Amru Al-Qadi, a drag queen. We mustn't offend the drag queens. Funnily enough, there is no mention of those who responded taking a different view, including one from Debbie Hayton, who responded to a tweet from another handmaid thus: "Yes, we do love her back. Trans people appreciate J.K. Rowling's courage in speaking out against an authoritarian ideology that oppresses women, gay people and trans people. We need to return to reality. Sex is real and it is immutable." It's impossible to know, of course, how many trans-identifying people agree with Debbie. I suspect it's a minority. It is, nevertheless, a minority of a minority that Ilaria disregards, and not the only one. Another response was from Jana Cornell, a black woman, who thanked JK and said that she had been told not to speak out about female genital mutilation, of which Jana is a victim, because it's transphobic. I recall witnessing this happening to Jana on Twitter a few years ago. How am I able to campaign for myself and millions of my sisters who have suffered if I can't recognise sex? Jana then turned to the handmaid Emma Watson and said, "You claim to care about Black lives, yet you support people who would drown out the conversation of FGM, which happens to Black and brown girls." Same goes for you, Ilaria. Later in the article, Ilaria says this: "It is important to recognise that not all self-proclaimed gender-critical feminists are white women, of course." Well, that's jolly nice of you to recognise this, of course. Women of colour engaged in anti-racist activism have expressed their support for gender-critical arguments, explicitly drawing parallels between systemic racism and the alleged oppression of cisgender women by trans activists. And there's no danger of you engaging with those arguments, of course. While the analysis of their motivations goes beyond the scope of this essay, you don't say. Their motivations couldn't possibly be exactly the same as those of white women, of wanting to fight our erasure as a sex class and the dismantling of our sex-based rights, of course. Now, listen to this. "It's probably safe to assume that minoritized women active in anti-racist politics are not deploying gender-critical logics with the deliberate intent to divert feminist struggles away from anti-racist and decolonial objectives and conversations." Is she for real? Yes, it probably is safe to assume that. I'd say it's probably the safest assumption you've ever made, Ilaria. What is missing is why you think any woman wants to divert attention away from anti-racist and decolonial objectives, but apparently you do. Linking to another post on the same website as her piece is on, she quotes Alyosha Tudor, who is, I believe, a lecturer in gender studies at one of the London universities, saying, "How bored and annoyed must J.K. Rowling be that she thinks the perfect moment in which she can reheat her comments is the height of Black Lives Matter." Do these people really think that because supporters of Black Lives Matter in the UK were doing a few marches and direct actions, everyone should stop talking about anything else? Did they attack people talking about the pandemic, about the recession, about the environment, climate change, domestic violence, sex trafficking, Israel and Palestine? No, of course they didn't. This is whataboutery, a deliberately contrived excuse to attack JKR for speaking up for women and to diminish women's concerns. In the minds of wokesters, as throughout the history of so-called progressives, sexism and misogyny and women's rights take last place. This incident is a good starting point to reflect on how gender-critical arguments interact both temporally and discursively with anti-racist, intersectional and decolonial critiques of Western white liberal feminism. Firstly, the exclusion of Black women and other women of colour from mainstream feminism. This, by the way, drew an objection on Twitter from a Black woman called Give Zero Fox. Only white feminism is mainstream, even though white women only make up circa 15% of women. Interesting point, which I confess I had not thought of, probably because I'm white. Which generations of Black and decolonial feminists have highlighted and fought against, seems to rest on not so dissimilar principles to the exclusion of trans women. She's saying that the exclusion of women of colour from mainstream feminism rests on similar principles to the exclusion of so-called trans women. I won't say that she's another one analogizing women of colour with trans-identifying men. I don't need to, because here is Ms. Fox again, speaking on her own behalf. What bullshit. Ilaria used her lily-white privilege to speak over black women and our specific female experiences, then perform a racial microaggression by comparing us to males. If you want an incisive and politically urgent analysis of black women, commission black writers. Even without Ms. Fox's, aka artless cervixaurus fecal blossom, my God, the only reason I wish I was still on Twitter is so I could follow this inventive woman. Even without her intervention, I wouldn't think Ilaria is right about the similar principles, because the principle, and there is only one, that excluding so-called trans women rests on, is that they are, of course, men, meaning adult human males. And this is something Ilaria, of course, omits to address. As is so often the case, we are just expected to take someone's word for it that men who claim to be women are indeed women. Well, why should we? Is it perchance because they are men and we should always submit to what they say? Under his eye. As for black women, there has never been, from second wave feminism to the present day in the UK, any deliberate exclusion on any principle. Based on my own experience of being in the women's movement and other progressive movements from the 1970s onwards, the problem has been not knowing how to be inclusive. When you have always, through no fault of your own, been part of a majority with all the privilege that entails, however much one can try to empathise and be open to learning and wanting to be inclusive, it's hard to know how not to be off-putting to those who aren't part of that majority. This has been an issue in just about every movement I've been in or known of. It was a problem in the Communist Party, in the trade union movement, in CND, in humanism, secularism, and the erstwhile skeptics community. So to suggest that there is any similarity in why, on the one hand, we say trans women are men, and on the other hand, why we have failed historically to attract more women of colour to feminist campaigns in countries where whites are the majority, is patently ridiculous and desperate. One of the core arguments of so-called gender-critical ideology is that trans women cannot be fully accepted as women because their experience of womanhood is not identical to that of cis women, and trans women can therefore not fully comprehend or empathise with the supposedly universal subordination of women. That's an argument, but it's not a core argument. The core tenet of gender criticism, as I keep saying, is that woman means adult human female, man means adult human male. Therefore, whatever they call themselves, however they feel, so-called trans women are men, and as such, they don't experience womanhood at all in any shape or form. That many trans-identifying men can't empathise with the subordination of women is obvious from their widespread participation in oppressive behaviours. This argument rests on the fiction of a single female experience, a fiction which has routinely silenced and sidelined women who experience racism, colonial domination, and other forms of oppression that cannot be singularly attributed to their gender. Nah, don't be so silly. Nobody believes there is a single female experience. Stop making shit up. It is precisely because we know that women have different experiences that we have spent the last 40 years trying to learn from women of different heritage and other cultures. Now, for reasons of time, I'm going to skip a bunch of stuff and bring this to a close with this. A mainstay of racist and Islamophobic discourse, the white victim has been mobilized to demonize black and Muslim men and call for racist and anti-migrant policies for centuries. I agree, but what has that got to do with saying that sex is real, that it matters, and that men can't be women? Nothing. Ilaria goes on to reference historical racist tropes from the US, the sexual assaults by gangs of immigrant men against predominantly young white women in Germany on New Year's Eve 6 years ago, and the subsequent rise in racist rhetoric and activity, and other stuff in a clumsy attempt to lure readers into thinking about racism. Enough already. As the fabulous Raquel Rosario Sanchez says in a piece I'll link to below, criticising white feminism seemed to be a way for white people to present themselves as different, better white people, as cool, intersectional feminists who just happen to be white. Ilaria's article was not well received by some of the women she is talking over. What Ilaria is doing is trying to get the gullibles to forge in their minds a link between gender criticism and racism that simply doesn't exist in reality. Gender-critical feminists in the UK are overwhelmingly drawn from the anti-racist left. Ilaria has made assertions that, at best, she has supported by linking to the opinions of non-entities who happen to agree with her. And the outstanding question that isn't answered in this absolute train crash of an article is why? Why doesn't she care about the distressed young schoolgirls having to put up with boys in their toilets and changing rooms? Why doesn't she care about the vulnerable women having to share housing space with rapists and paedophiles? Why doesn't she care about the men who are crushing the dreams of young sportswomen or breaking their bones and then laughing about it? There is nothing remotely scholarly about this article, and yet it has been posted on an LSE blog and promoted thus. Ilaria Michelis gives an incisive and politically urgent analysis of the connections between trans-exclusionary and racist feminist ideologies. No, she bloody doesn't. She just says stuff and hopes people will be dumb enough to believe them, even though she spectacularly fails to prove there is any truth, any merit whatsoever in anything she says, and if there is any silver lining to be squeezed out of this abomination, it is that it provides further confirmation that gender studies is a load of claptrap. It's like homeopathy. It should have no place in any academic institution. Thanks for watching. Bye.